I should say at this moment I'm about to complete a new book. It's called The Lost Quantum Science of the Maya. And the focus of this book is actually to try to explain how psychedelics work. But that is something you can't really address without addressing all the kind of problems that has been discussed here when it comes to psychological and spiritual evolution. And what I assert here is really then that the currently dominating paradigm in our modern science is completely inadequate for addressing these questions, and that we really have to make a very, very radical total break with much of the science that we've been told is science. And what I'm asserting then is really that what we should replace it with is a kind of quantum science that emanated from the ancient Maya. And that's a long story to go into, but I would say that the Maya plays in a very special role, the loss of the Mayan science. And it was really a loss of the Mayan science when the Catholic bishops would burn all the Mayan books. It's much more of a loss than I think most people realize. And the reason is that unlike most other, or I would say all other ancient civilizations, the Maya developed a science that was essentially mathematically based. We call it a calendar, but that's not really what it's about. It's actually a kind of a science. And even if they didn't come to a complete understanding of the world in their day based on this, I think that would have provided a better starting point for science as it is today. And there is the possibility that I'm certainly developing in this coming book of mine to recreate what science would have been like if we would not have lost this very significant part of civilizational evolution that was contributed by the Maya. I would just here then, it's been wonderful to listen to the speakers here who have much more direct experience than I have in terms of applying new ways of looking at the world to the kind of psychological problems that we call them, associated with, for instance, Kundalini rising and so forth. My perspective is then to look at this from a bigger perspective, though, not so personal and not so therapeutic, you might say, but try to understand what happens in the larger scale of things. And I think that's really where the loss of the Mayan calendar becomes most evident. And so I was rereading the book of Gopi Krishna, I think written in 1975, and he's pleading, you might say, to have Western scientists investigate the phenomenon of Kundalini. And I think overall we can say nothing has happened in that regard. And there are numbers of reasons for this. But I would say that the framework is not there. In terms of accepted academic science, the framework is not there to address such a phenomenon as Kundalini rising and the effects that are on a biological and spiritual mental levels that are associated with this phenomenon. So I will just sort of touch upon the kind of framework that I believe that the Mayan quantum science would provide for this. And I've called my talk "The Serpent and the Tree." And from that, you can already gather that this is something that's based on ancient thinking. I would say all cultures of our planet had an idea of a tree of life, and many had also an idea of a serpent as being the creator of our existence. And eventually, in this talk, I will try to connect that with how human evolution, the kind of human evolution that we can understand from this ancient basis, and how that can provide an understanding of, in turn, of Kundalini energy. So let me start there, and if you can show the next slide, please. Then Gopi Krishna made the claim that Kundalini was an evolutionary energy, and that's a strong statement, of course. I mean, just because you have some kind of an effect on a person, some kind of powerful change, doesn't mean necessarily that it's an evolutionary part of an evolutionary process. You know, there are many things that we do that may even be good and maybe even be valuable and support our own lives, that are not necessarily evolutionary. So I'm asking the question then, is this true? Is it really an evolutionary energy that Kundalini provides? And then the second thing, you know, in his book, he really, you might say, asks for Western scientists, and I'm one of them, to try to bring understanding to this phenomenon of Kundalini. But you know, already at this point, you're in a direct conflict with modern academic science, in particular then with Darwinism, because Darwinism is the dominating ideology, you might say, of modern science, and that gives no room for something like Kundalini to be an evolutionary force, especially not in a spiritual sense of the word. The Darwinist idea, which is almost, you know, you're not in modern academic context, you're not allowed to present anything non-Darwinist, I would like to say. And in that idea, this theory, evolution is a product of random mutations. And so it's what I'm saying here, that if you are going to go along with Gopi Krishna and claim that Kundalini is an evolutionary energy, and I would say, personally, I think I'm right, that he was right, but you would be completely up against the whole, you know, massive resistance of modern science if you would make such a claim. So it's not necessarily possible to have Western scientists do something about the situation that in the way that he was hoping for. It's a tremendous resistance you would come up against. Can I have the next slide, please? This is just a picture of coming into some other kind of understanding of evolution. And what I really want to emphasize here is that, you know, you can't explain something like Kundalini if you are still abiding with a view of evolution that is being upheld by modern science. You have to find a new way of understanding the factors that are driving evolution. And I think a key component for that is the whole concept of the serpent. And what I'm showing here is a picture I took probably 30 or 40 years ago in Chichen Itza in Yucatan, and it shows a head from a feathered serpent. And next slide, please. Why is it? And this is the pyramid of the plumed serpent in Chichen Itza, and this I took on the special day on the equinox. You can see on the sides of the staircase there. You can see a series of 7 triangles that are coming out in a serpent head. This is the central pyramid of Chichen Itza, and what really it demonstrates is that this whole city was actually built to honor the plumed serpent. And when I came here first time in 1979, it really, and I came from a high-level laboratory in Sweden, very rationally working and so forth, and I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that these people would have been worshipping a serpent. Why would that be? And I think it's still essentially not understood why they would have as their central deity the main creator god, you might say, a serpent, the plumed serpent. A plumed serpent then means that it had feathers, it could fly. What is this about? And I think this is something that gives us a lead to where we can actually find the evolutionary serpent factors that is driving the universe. They did not just make a mistake among the Maya when they devoted their biggest city to this plumed serpent. Next slide, please. And the plumed serpent is not just a Mayan or Aztec thing. The Aztecs called it Quetzalcoatl. That's more the famous name for it. What you see here is from a temple in Egypt, and you see 2 cobras, and you see feathers. They are flying, and then there is a winged disc in the center, and that's really what brings the divine message. It's actually that central ring that you can see here. But the point really here is it wasn't just a Mayan thing to believe that there was a feathered serpent. Here you have very clearly a feathered serpent from Egypt. Next slide, please. And I'm here giving examples of other serpents as the major deity of creation. Obviously among the Aztecs and the Maya, but you have it in among the Australian Aborigines. They call it the rainbow serpent. And you have it in the Amazonas, where they say that the great anaconda was the creator of the human species. And the Bushmen, you have a 70,000-year-old python in Botswana has been discovered, supposedly the oldest piece of art that exists on our planet. It's a great serpent, really. And as I showed in the previous picture, before the monotheist religions took over in the Near Orient and the Mediterranean context, that you have all kinds of serpents, cosmic serpents, as they're referred to in the Near Orient. So this is a fairly, I'm not saying that it's completely universal, but it's a fairly universal phenomenon. The belief that was a creator god that was a serpent. And next slide, please. And this is completely different than from the modern way of understanding evolution. Next slide, please. Next slide. So one way of understanding these serpent is to recognize, I would say, that really what these serpents are about are creative waves that emanate from the center of the universe. And those are the waves that are creating life. And this is really then what I should say. This is completely different from what would be accepted science. But nonetheless, if you start to study how these waves were calibrated by the ancient Maya, and how these are waves that are alternating between peaks and valleys, and that's true for all kinds of waves, you will find that all aspects of life, especially the biological kind of life, but also much, the more mental aspects of evolution that are coming up, are actually then quite closely charted by the kind of waves that the Maya were basing their calendar system on. So the calendar system of the Maya has been much misrepresented, and especially before the year 2012, all kinds of things were said about it. But if you really look upon it as a science and take it seriously, you will have to acknowledge that the waves that they described in their calendar system, and that was honored by the pyramid of Kukulkan in Chichen Itza, they very well describe the emergence of different life forms on our planet. And next slide, please. So this is the simplest forms of life. And then, when it comes to the higher life forms, which we call animals and plants and so forth, you will see that the different shifts in these waveforms will, whenever a new peak begins, there is a major emergence of a new class of organisms. And the fact that classes of organisms are emerging not gradually and slowly, but in huge bursts of new kinds of organisms has been known for a very long time. And it's exactly opposite to what the Darwinist idea tells you. According to the Darwinist idea, biological evolution is driven by slow, gradual, random mutations. And there's nothing in the fossil record that supports that kind of idea. But for ideological reasons, this is still maintained by academic biology. What does fit, however, and I'm not going to be able to make a complete presentation of the evidence in this case, but what does fit, and I hope this picture gives that view, is the waveforms that the Maya were describing. And if you go back to the pyramid of Kukulkan and show that picture again, there we go. So here you have 7 triangles that are like scales of the back of the serpent. They are then, you might say, symbolizing these kind of waves that I'm showing. This is a message to the future, I would say. And what really creates our world, and I would say creates us as well as all other species is the kind of interference patterns that are being are the results of these different waves. There are 9 different waves, and to get an idea how this can underlie the formation of a biological organism, we can take the example of the science of cymatics, which is really, it's about sound waves, and that's another kind of waves. But nonetheless, what you can see when you study cymatics is that if you have different waves that together are creating interference patterns, then you will get a kind of an underlying structure that underlies, as you can see here, different kinds of patterns. And that's really then what I'm proposing is that we ourselves are built from. We are created by these kind of interference patterns of different waves. And it's a theory that very strongly fits with the actual data of how biological organisms have emerged. Next slide, please. And this whole thing then, where does this waves come from? Well, ultimately, if you look at the Mayan sources and from many other sources as well, they ultimately come from what they would call the heart of sky or the tree of life. And the tree of life is then really like it's a geometry that exists on several different levels of the cosmos. And what you see here is really then how information, geometric information, trickles down from the cosmic level through the galactic level, through the heliospheric or in the solar system level, and then down to the global, and then down to the biological organism like ourselves. So we are, through these waves emanating from the cosmic tree of life, we are ourselves created as in the image of the tree of life. And next slide, please. And we have a lot of, ancient symbols. This is about 4,000 years old from Sumeria, and it's called the Lord of the Good Tree. And what you see here is in the mid center, you see a axis, a rod, if you like, which is then really the good tree, the tree of life symbolized. But then you also see 2 serpents that are interacting with each other, and in fact then creating an interference pattern emanating from this tree of life. Next slide, please. And here you have something similar. At the bottom there, you see the tree of life. This is a Mayan codex, the Codex Selden, and you see an eye actually looking out from the tree of life. But then you also see 2 serpents, and that are what can I say? They are climbing around the tree, and at the top you see the human being that is being born from this, is being created by the tree of life, and the messengers for this creation is then the waves, the serpents that you can see, 2 serpents' heads. So you have another example here. Next slide, please. And here you see from China, you see the legendary creators of Chinese civilization, Fuxi and Nova, his twin sister, and they're bringing civilization. It's a wave that brings civilization, and you can see the serpents at the bottom, so to speak. It's a serpent phenomena that is creating our life. It's not only that it creates us as biological beings, but the higher levels of this pyramid actually then brings the capacities for us to become spiritual beings and evolve mentally. And with that mental evolution, there also comes a technological evolution that we are in the midst of right now. Please, next. And here comes probably what's the most famous example of the tree of life and the serpent, and it's the story. It's of the biblical version of the tree of life, and you know the whole thing, the Genesis story, and the point to realize here is that, unlike most other ancient cultures, the Jewish culture which became the beginning of Christianity was negative to the serpent. And I think that's, you know, in the story that they made up in the Bible, the serpent is cursed, and the humans are cursed, for actually interacting and for seeking knowledge. That's really the crime that they did. And instead came a religion that was basically very intolerant and just created a god in the image of the human beings, rather than how it's actually being performed, which is then really through tree of life and its interactions with the serpent. And here, you know, I think a step was taken to really block the possibility of developing a true science as to how the world is created, because that happens essentially not through a God created in our own image. It happens through the interaction of the geometry of a tree of life and the serpents that are bringing the knowledge, the creativity, and so forth to the human beings. Next slide, please. But it's important, I think, to see that there is it's not all ancient peoples had that kind of view. Most of them were favorable to the serpent. Most of them saw that the serpent was the actual creator. In other words, when I say serpent here, what I'm referring to is what we would talk about as waves of creation that emanate from the center of the universe. But then, of course, we also have this serpent symbolism in India, and that's the whole thing about Kundalini rising is often metaphorically described as a serpent. As a serpent energy that starts with your root chakra and moves upwards. And this is essentially what's been discussed so far in this symposium. And why would the serpent come in here? You know, it's a good question. Was Gopi Krishna right when he said that the Kundalini is part of the evolutionary process of humankind? And it seems, to begin with, that most ancient cultures did believe that the serpent was a significant evolutionary force. And then the question is that the same, or is it evolutionary force that we are metaphorically talking about when we are looking at Kundalini rising? Or and how could that be connected? You know, really what this tells us is that the human being there that you see far down in this nested hierarchy of levels is really then created in the image of the tree of life. And the tree of life, as we've seen several examples of, is then also connected to the serpents. The serpents emanate from the tree of life. So if you go back to the picture that I was just recently, you know, if the midline of the human body is then really an expression of the tree of life on our own level, where else would it be, you might say? Well, then it's not so surprising that there is some kind of a serpent-like energy, some kind of a spiraling energy that may be connected to this tree of life. You know, given that we've seen that this tree of life emanates serpents or waves in several levels. It's just a question of why would this be spiraling, so to speak. That's I think maybe it's the next picture that I have that we'll come back to that. Yeah, so if you see the faces there, I can't go into detail about this. It just looks at the higher levels, the 5 highest level of the pyramid of evolution that we saw in Chichen Itza. Then you can see that if you look at the face, it's actually these are different quantum states that human beings are go through at the higher levels, or in other words, for the past 100,000 years. Then you can see that it's actually a spiraling movement of yin-yang dualities that human is part of the human natural evolution. That each level, as you can see, whether it's the 5th, the 6th, or 7th, is associated with a particular quantum state. And if you think of yourself as going through that kind of a change in quantum states, this kind of a spiralic movement, then which you can see to the right there results in completely different kinds of relationships to the divine. And these are easily verified through the human history. You know, you can see the religious phase. You can see that when the atheism started with the Industrial Revolution, with the 7th wave and so forth. But then, you know, the point is really to see that this is a spiralic movement. And if you go back to the previous slide, this spiralic movement that is the human evolution, at least from the perspective of Mayan quantum science, that spiralic movement is a movement around the tree of life. And so what we're seeing here really is that I would say that ultimately the Kundalini rising is not a biological phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that may have biological effects. And that's what's been talked about partly in this symposium, that there is an energy coming through your spine or a spiralic movement like this. But that ultimately comes from the going through the alternating quantum states that are actually creating human evolution. Please go on to the next slide. Given this, it's not surprising that, you know, if you look at this spiralic movement of quantum states that the human being goes through in her evolution, it's not surprising that sometimes that gets blocked for some reason, and then sometimes also released. And these blockages, every quantum state that human beings go through will require some change, something will happen. It could happen spontaneously, but most likely it happens in people that are doing some kind of spiritual exercises, whether it's yoga or martial arts or anything like that, that will release this spiralic movement that is actually part of the natural evolutionary process of humankind. So, I would give Gopi Krishna right in his idea that, yes, this is an evolutionary process or evolutionary force. But at the same time, I think it's almost impossible to have this be accepted by academic science in the way that he was hoping for, because the whole perspective is completely different. The Mayan perspective that I'm presenting here is a cosmic perspective. And it's a cosmic perspective that presents the human beings as cosmic beings. And I would say that that's the only background from which we can understand such a phenomenon as Kundalini rising. It is a resulting of a sequence of quantum states, quantum leaps between quantum states that is generating this kind of phenomena. And it is our natural point to go towards. The ninth wave, as you can see, the quantum state there has no veils. There's nothing darkened in this. And we're not there yet as a species. Some individuals may already be there, but it is the ultimate goal of this creation, I would say. Once you understand it from the perspective of Mayan quantum science, of different quantum states that are generated, an evolution of humankind. Next, please. And, well, this is just to show that, these waves are not just about biology. They have played a fundamental role. They are the ones that lead to the rise and fall of civilizations. And at this moment, I should mention also, we are at the beginning of a new night. And next slide, please. It's so there are certain troublesome things going on in the world, especially in the western part of the world, I would say, and it has to do with these shifting waves. Next slide, please. But the point to realize also is that at the current time, since 2011, all the waves are up and running in parallel, and they bring different outlooks on life. They bring different perception of life, but they also bring different ways of creating life. Essentially, human beings they project the quantum state that they're in resonance with onto the world and create this in accordance with it. And the highest waves that you could see earlier are the 8th and the 9th waves. And those are waves that are bringing back, the 8th wave brings back the light to the right brain half, whereas the 9th wave, as we saw, was one without any veils, without any dualities, and so forth. So at the current time in the world, you might say that we have passed the very significant shift when all the 9 waves were activated in 2011, and now it's somewhat of a conflicting world where on the one hand you have people that are developing resonance with the 8th and 9th wave and are going towards you could call it an awakening Kundalini or enlightenment or so forth. And at the same time, the 6th wave, which is the long-term patriarchal civilizational wave since 5,000 years ago, is now going into a night, into you might say, a dark age. And there is sort of a big conflict in the world especially in the West, I should say, resulting from somewhat conflicting effects of the waves that we see at the current time. Different kinds of quantum states, or you could call them yin-yang dualities, are generating different kinds of approaches to life. And that is then, it's just another, talk about Kundalini rising is just another language for exactly the same kind of thing. But again, as I'm coming back to is I believe and I'm convinced that the Mayan contribution is absolutely crucial in this. No other civilization can help bring a science to understand these phenomena, because no other civilization had the kind of mathematical basis for their cosmology in ancient times. And so that's what I've been working with, and I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you.